What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Max.
This is Joey.
And today we have a special guest on, Dr. Eric Graff, a professor here at our seminary, medieval historian. Dr. Graff, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Max. Well, just for your audience, I trained as a medievalist. My academic background is at the University of Toronto with a PhD in medieval studies, and then at a licentiate earned from the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies located in Toronto too. So most of my research, as you know, is oriented toward manuscripts from the medieval period, but I do teach church history at the seminary, and so we cover a wide range of topics there.
What was it like going to school in Toronto?
Toronto's a fantastic city especially to be a graduate student in, I think.
Yeah.
It's a huge university. It's a great town to be educated in all kinds of different neighborhoods, and to get a real variety of life there as a graduate student. It would be very difficult, I can tell you, if we were trying to raise kids in the city.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think it really suited that phase of life, so I enjoyed it a lot.
Yes, you're a husband and a father as well?
Yes.
Yes.
So my wife and I have two kids, both in Catholic high schools here in Columbus.
Cool, yeah. Okay, and just give us a little bit of context too, because and I'm always interested to hear about like stuff that you're working on, because other than teaching church history in the seminary,
he just reads a bunch of random books.
Well, he's like going, he's going all over the place, like uncovering like medieval manuscripts and reading them. So like, tell us a little bit about that kind of side of your career and that part of the work you do.
Yeah, well, the project I was on just before coming to the seminary was a project to publish facsimiles of medieval manuscripts. So one of the things that has happened, very fortunately, in the world of libraries that hold manuscripts is many of them are becoming digitized. So we have an idea. The project I was on paid for the digital capture of a few of these manuscripts, and it was in Ireland, and the project was to publish some of the earliest or most famous Irish manuscripts. And the book I worked on was associated with the earliest manuscript for the life of St. Columba, St. Columba of Iona. So it was a great privilege to work with the primary materials and to spend enough time with them to study them kind of from a forensic point of view.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means publishing editions of the text, but in this case it was a project to publish a full image facsimile of the manuscript.
So Nicolas Cage and Tom Hanks aren't the only ones that study manuscripts?
No.
Oh, nice.
No, but I have been, you mentioned Tom Hanks. People who've worked in manuscript libraries sometimes chuckle at the way that that's depicted. It's not as glamorous as you might think.
You don't just grab it and are looking.
Well,
like
some of these places are lovely places to visit.
Yeah.
But when they finally show you through to the room where you work, it may not be the grand hall that you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just a closet with a fluorescent light. And you
like our studio. Okay.
Well, one of the cool parts of our semesters, I think I had you for Western Civ in college.
Yeah.
And then I've had you 2 times for church history now in theology. And typically once a semester you take us up to our library has a really cool rare book room, and he's like, it's really cool. He gets to like show us these manuscripts and walk us through like what goes into making, like things that I would never think about.
The binding of the books, like that there's a whole thing to it, like the types of paper and the types of ink used to preserve these works and the work that goes into it. Like from a librarian standpoint too, like it also helped me kind of respect and admire the work that's done in a lot of libraries around the world, because that's something I think modern man is so insensitive to what it's taken to preserve some of these works for so long. As we're so kind of accustomed to just expecting some libraries to hold these works.
Well, it's one of the great privileges to take people in and show them some of the rare books or manuscript materials. And often, Catholics will know this in various places. Just haphazardly, you sometimes find a manuscript fragment or a leaf that has been given to the pastor in some past, time. And from time to time, even here, we'll have people phone up to say, we were cleaning out the rectory, we found 3 different framed manuscript leaves, but we don't know what they are. Can you come and take a look? So that's a pleasure too, is just to be able to educate someone on what they have.
Yeah, that's so cool.
If they weren't themselves the collector who knew what it was. And then maybe to arrange for these things to be preserved or given to a place where they'll be kept well.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of experience when it comes to all of your medieval stuff. And one of the medieval topics,
the whole basket,
medieval world,
medieval world, and you're kind of you're well qualified in this stuff, and you know this stuff, and that's one of the reasons we brought you on. right? We brought you on to particularly discuss the Inquisition, and it's not only a medieval thing. So, lest we go that route, that's not the case. But one of the reasons
before we talk about the Inquisition, though, we gotta say the important stuff.
What is it?
Go visit our Patreon page.
We're trying to get money. So
yeah. So if you like Logos Podcast and you would prefer that we continue doing what we do, we could use your help. So now we have a Patreon page, as you may have seen on our Instagram account. Wow. So you can go to patreon.com/Logos Podcast and you can become a monthly donor. It's like $5 or $10 a month.
Or $500 a month.
Whatever you want, really.
But also it's on our website.
It's on our website too?
Yeah, so if you go to our website, there's a tab that says Patreon on it. And so do consider giving to this project. Literally every single dime goes into the project. Nothing goes to us except that one meal and the bottles of wine, the champagne. But other than that, we're pretty good, you know. Yeah, we bought you that gift, that watch. Yes, this is coming from here too. No, but do consider giving to the project. Check us out on TikTok, Instagram, MySpace, my favorite of all of them, of course. Do consider going to YouTube, and we're releasing content like this. And I think it's also important that you know that we're praying for you.
Yeah,
you know, and as Joey has mentioned before on our platform, that you know, if you do give to this project in a future, in a hopeful soon future, we'll be providing exclusive content for you all as donors and supporters of this project in that way.
But right now, we just want your money. So,
like I said last time, I mean, we're going on 4 months since we've eaten, and so this would be a good opportunity to feed a couple of young men that are starving.
Young seminarians, yeah. So yeah, Patreon. Also follow us on Instagram, and we have a TikTok now.
TikTok,
right?
Yeah, YouTube. We're getting out there.
So yeah,
I hope you're okay.
I'm subscribe, do all that stuff too. So okay, now we can get into.
Oh, that's right. This is
Inquisition with Dr. Eric Graff, which is going to be exciting.
So that's a topic. We're going to talk about the Inquisition, and one of the reasons I think we wanted to talk about the Inquisition is because we see a very kind of tainted idea in popular media through figures like Joe Rogan and even TED Talk, and a lot of people in general have this very, very limited view, I would say, of what the Inquisition is, particular events that have taken place within what's called the Inquisition, and the Inquisition as an office of the church that still remains. Mm-hmm. And so, Doctor, we brought you on because of your qualifications, but also because you know, we've had you in class and we know how you interact with this stuff, and it's very interesting for us just to talk about it. Like, just to have you here personally is a great privilege, but also for our audience to have a more broad and I would say more accurate kind of historical perception as to what actually is the Inquisition.
Yeah, so I guess to start, Doctor, like what. We're talking about these popular views of the Inquisition so like Max mentioned, we hear people kind of bash the church on the grounds that this terrible thing existed called the Inquisition in the Middle Ages, right? And it kind of fits into this bigger narrative of, the Middle Ages was this period of darkness and superstition, and the church had this like tyrannical authority over everyone, and the Inquisition was a part of this. So those are kind of popular views that we kind of hear about the Inquisition. Yep. Are there any that, like, do you... in the world you live in, do you also come across incorrect kind of derogatory views of the church in the Middle Ages and the Inquisition more specifically?
Well, yeah, I think being a medievalist, you deal with certain misconceptions all the time.
Yeah.
But the idea of what people commonly think of the Inquisition now, in America, you know, when I grew up, the popular notions of the Inquisition, as I was a teenager, for instance, would devolve immediately upon either the Monty Python sketch, or
which you still use,
or on the segment from History of the World that Mel Brooks does. You know, these you know, kind of ridiculous and very funny takes on something that, you know, had a very serious and, you know, background in the history of the church. But a lot of people oversubscribe to the issues that they associate with, say, violence or kind of an abusive judicial process. They kind of indiscriminately attribute that to religion sometimes, and then often without making distinction to the Catholic Church's Inquisition in its different forms. One example I'll say is that a lot of American students I've found over the years sometimes confuse the Inquisition even with something like the Puritan witch trials in the
Yes, it's true. Yeah.
And so that's their image of an Inquisition, which they would kind of blandly apply either to the Puritan communities where those things happened or to the Catholic Church, which are, you know, very different things in the details at least. So that's a kind of general association that's sometimes made. I also think that when people think of an inquisition, they think that the function of an inquisition is itself either unnecessary or abusive. That is, that there would never be any cause to inquire about someone else's faith this way.
Yeah.
And therefore the very act of doing it is somehow inappropriate.
Yeah.
And that's something that, when you're sensitive to certainly the historical reality, but also to the reality of faith, you realize that nothing could be more serious, really.
Mm-hmm. Or also authority itself.
Yes.
Right. Which is increasingly becoming the case, and we've talked about.
Yeah.
Like, authority itself is now suspected, against being abusive immediately.
And that's also a viewpoint certainly supported in our modern American society, where, who are you to tell me what I should believe?
Yeah.
That's very commonly a cultural assumption in America. And we have a pluralistic religious landscape in our history for a reason. And so especially regarding religion, Americans tend to think that any sort of prying into that is by itself abusive somehow.
Which is why it's probably really easy for Americans to hear about anything like the Inquisition and immediately associate it with like the Puritan witch trials, right? Like, yeah, we're hunting people down and burning them at the stake because they're witches. Like,
or the Galileo case, the famous Galileo case. Like, the Inquisition handles things in this way, right?
Yeah, so they have an assumption, especially from something like Galileo, that it's a representation of the church's authority over against a scientific principle or something like that. And certainly the Galileo case is definitive for a lot of the ways that people think of issues of faith and reason, issues of church and state sometimes, and so that's certainly an episode that put the church way behind the eight ball relative to her relationship to science over the years.
Yeah, and maybe we can, even if there's time, touch on the Galileo trial just in a kind of in what am I trying to say? In summary.
Yeah.
But first, before we get into that, there's a lot of confusion about what the Inquisition is. So now I'd be delighted, Doctor, if you could actually help us understand, what is it? Like, what do we mean when we say the Inquisition? What is it really?
Well, we've talked about this in class, of course, but the notion of doing an Inquisition, which is really an inquiry about faith and keeping the proper faith within the church, is something that goes all the way back to the very first phase of the church herself. You could think of Paul's letters as a version of this, where people are actually reaching out for help in some of these matters. Typically, others would cite the letter of Clement, which is still around the year, it's in the 60s AD, somewhere maybe 70 AD, where you have the first instance of a community split over certain issues, some doctrinal, some simply community issues, that they bring to the papacy specifically so that they can be sorted out and be given a definitive settlement on some of these matters. So we know that that's always been part of the charism of the See of Peter, is this kind of court of last resort when you can't get a definitive settlement about something, especially about faith and morals. You would go to the heart of the church to have some instruction in that way. And hopefully that would heal whatever rift was in the community. So the basic function of that is long established, and it's necessary. Inquisitions in the early centuries of the church were handled either by an appeal to Rome, or in some cases an appeal to a local bishop if it could be settled at that level, and by means of councils. So you may think of something like a major question about the extension of the faith to the Gentiles, the Council of Jerusalem, or a major question about the teaching of Arius at Nicaea.
Nicaea.
One of the driving factors of the Council of Nicaea is the threat of heresy. And in that case, this is a distinction that deserves to be made, is that heresy isn't just an individual's falling away from the faith. Heresy here, especially when brought to something like an ecumenical council, is a matter that's serious enough to present a competitive or an alternative vision of the whole church, something that would deviate from the deposit of faith and lead many other people astray. So Arius was certainly that kind of character. He's a very charismatic preacher. He was becoming very famous. There was confusion about what exactly he was teaching, and the council was able to discern exactly what he was teaching. And in the judgments afterward, they're their eventual settlement was to banish him from the Christian areas of the empire there. But that didn't bring an end to Arianism, as we know.
Yeah.
The idea was to separate that threat from the communities of the church.
Right. And so to our listeners, Arius is the father of Arianism, right, which is a heresy in the church that believes that Jesus Christ is a pure man. Is merely a man.
There's a creature, some sort of creature.
Some sort of perfect creature, maybe,
and that
or
he's
something.
therefore not fully God and fully man.
Right. So this is a heresy in the church, and Arius is the leader. But just to kind of maybe kind of succinctly put what you were saying, just to make sure I understand myself, is like heresy is not ultimately just about one guy says this thing, this truth that is incorrect, we would say, but it affects the larger body of the church, which is to say it affects it because a portion of the body of the church wants to separate itself from the church itself.
Yeah, and so what we talk about as heresies, something like a misunderstanding of the human person, or too extreme a disparagement of, let's say, the material body, or something like that. Gnosticism, all of these other expressions of malformed belief, let's say, that lead to very serious social deviations.
Sure.
Those things arise as heresy, of course, and when they're dealt with in a council or when they're dealt with directly by the papacy, that's one thing. And in the early history of the church is full of those examples. When you get to the Middle Ages, what you have that's typical of the form of an inquisition is an inquisitorial court called for the particular purpose of someone who has become identified with heresy, who is of some influence. Again, this doesn't just involve if I'm a cobbler and I have a slightly misunderstood version of the Trinity in my head,
the Inquisition, most of us do.
Sure. A pastor will try to help you with that, but you won't be pulled before the Inquisition.
Sure.
If you become a popular preacher and openly preach against the church, then the local bishop or the pope, in this context, would convene an inquisitorial court, especially for your case.
Right.
And that court's sole job is to discern whether it's heresy and to elicit some sort of reconciliation from that person, that they would acknowledge that they had an error, for instance, confess and rejoin the church. That's the ideal.
And so when we talk about the Inquisition in this sense, we talk about the Inquisition as an office of the church.
Yes,
is that right?
It's a temporary office.
Okay.
So it's the kind of thing that any bishop could call together.
Okay. Yeah.
If I'm a local bishop and there's this problem, I could convene an inquisition.
Yeah.
But once that case was heard, that court disappears again. It's not a permanent office. It's not someone's full-time job outside of that. And you would put someone, who could be a canonical judge, for instance, a judicial authority in that place. Once the settlement of that matter has happened, then there's no continuing inquisition.
Yeah.
The other two types of inquisition that typically we talk about are the Spanish Inquisition and what's associated now with the Holy Office, which is now the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The Spanish Inquisition differs from that medieval or that other type of inquisitorial court because the Spanish Inquisition, A, becomes permanent. That is, it becomes a permanent office within the Spanish territories. And B, it gains a measure of independence from the papacy, and it runs itself formally under the king's offices. So that was for the first time putting an inquisitorial office underneath secular jurisdiction, so that it operated together with the Spanish push toward reconquest of all of Spain.
Yeah.
This is a period when Spain is still reconquering the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, and really it starts in 1480 with the Spanish. But then that Inquisition, that office in the Spanish world, follows all of the Spanish extension into the New World and the colonies, and that will remain formally a permanent Inquisition until the 1830s.
Wow.
Okay, cool. So just to repeat back to you kind of what you just helped us understand, just to make sure I'm following and our listeners, giving them a chance to keep up. So the kind of inquisitorial function of the church has been present from the very beginning. And
certainly in the heart of the church.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And in the early centuries of the church, this took the form of maybe even just writing to like the Pope for like clarification on a matter of faith and morals.
Sure.
And then later like the councils you mentioned, an ecumenical council. So when the church is doing that in the first few centuries before the Middle Ages, it's kind of doing the same thing that later an Inquisition will do. Just the Inquisition, when we get to the Middle Ages, then these inquisitorial bodies arise in response to particular problems throughout Christendom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
And then 1480, you get this distinct type of thing, which is not just a normal Inquisition that arise all the time and are used to deal with particular matters of heresy throughout the church, but we get the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, which is particularly attached to a political system arising in Spain with Isabel and Ferdinand as an extension of the branch of, to some extent, at least for popular view, it's that this is particularly church operating within Spain.
Yeah.
Right. And so that maybe that's part of the distinction that needs to be made here. So the Inquisition moves to Spain under the guise of Ferdinand and Isabella. But what is the church's relationship to that command or to that permission?
I wouldn't say it moves there just because that implies that it left somewhere else.
Okay, that's fair.
Right?
Okay,
so it's established in Spain under their rule, partly because they're in this process of reunifying Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, for the listeners, Spain had been a very complex kingdom in the Middle Ages, and it had populations that were Jewish, populations that were Muslim, and populations that were Christian, and this had been the case for hundreds of years.
Yep.
One of the strategies of reconquering the entire territory under one Christian kingdom was that Ferdinand and Isabella expelled as subjects Muslims and Jews from their kingdom.
Right.
Now, some of them, would have converted to become Catholic and therefore remain subjects of the crown. The special nature of the Inquisition in Spain, one of the justifications for it was that they felt like they needed to police, in some sense, these newly converted communities to be sure that they were truly converting and not simply doing so in order to remain subjects of the crown.
Okay.
Right.
So the Spanish Inquisition is first formed really to police Christians who had been Muslim or Jewish.
Yeah.
Of course, this is another distinction. The Inquisition could never, even in the worst, cases of abuse, could never apply itself to someone who wasn't Christian. It doesn't make any sense to inquire about the faith of someone who doesn't profess Christianity.
Yeah. So the Inquisition it's not seeing, there's not a guy who's a member of the Inquisition seeing a Muslim on the road and going to tackle him because he doesn't believe in
Come back
faith.
here.
No.
Yeah.
And but the Spanish Inquisition did become very invasive in some sense, but it was built to police those communities that did, officially at least, convert to Catholicism in order, maybe in order to become subjects of the crown, but it was about creating a unified culture after the variety that had been there through the Middle Ages. So when it's established in Spain, it doesn't mean that it goes away elsewhere. So that's 1480 is when it's established in Spain. Mm-hmm. It has a special license, and the papacy does agree to let the Spanish crown administer that office. Mm-hmm. So that's a special privilege. The Holy Office, which is the third of those categories that we mentioned before, is the name for the function within the papacy itself. And of course, there's a special way in which the papacy always has to be prepared to answer questions of faith and morals. And so the naming of it as the Holy Office and the configuration of it in canon law in that period didn't happen until the 1560s.
Okay.
And so it gets a new definition in the 16th century. The papacy has always had that function somehow or another.
Yeah.
But it's called the Holy Office then. It becomes the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith now. And so it still has that job of making sure that that Catholics profess the proper faith and that they remain united in faith, and that some of them aren't going off in one direction while losing contact with the deposit of faith in any sense. So those functions remain. As I said, the Spanish Inquisition is the one that becomes permanent, and it's the one that becomes an arm of the monarchy in Spain.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So relating to that, so we have these three distinct kind of modes in which the Inquisition presents itself in history. The more particular ones that arise to particular, problems throughout the Christian world, the Spanish Inquisition, and then the Holy Office, which is just the Pope's exercise of his inquisitorial power when it needs to be exercised.
Yeah.
Right. So with the Spanish Inquisition, so to a lot of modern listeners, the idea of a king and a queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, trying to do what they did, like trying to unite a country in with one religion, and even creating that seems very probably a lot of people that doesn't sound too good, just because we're used to pluralism and
the idea of having to force somebody to convert, or even potentially force somebody to convert, is just very.
So could you talk about, was it with Ferdinand and Isabella, was this more of a political move to unite the kingdom politically, or was this prerogative of the church to make a particular people Catholic?
I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
So both of
nice.
those. It certainly has all kinds of political benefits.
Okay.
Sure. Right. For instance. And in its initial configuration, it's also very serious about trying to create a fully Catholic, kingdom. So the idea of making those two things happen certainly is not in the experience, even in the ambition of American Catholics, in the sense that, we all grow up with the experience, let's say, that we're Catholic in America in part because it was a pluralist society.
Yeah.
Right? And that the control was not exercised to purge us out of that early mixture.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the American framework for this is, clearly different.
Mm-hmm.
And from the point of view of the church, the norm through most of this period of the Middle Ages was that you had a strong Catholic king, and the church cooperated and partnered with that Catholic monarch to do all the things the church did, whether that was education or charities or other types of things. But the assumption was in that partnership, and that the closer it could be, the better. That was their idea.
Right.
It should be noted that inquisitions, as any sort of judicial proceeding, only ever show up where you have a kind of configuration of Christendom that is an official presence for the church, and a presence for the church that is recognized by the government as cooperative.
Okay, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So when in those conditions in the history of the church, where the church is, let's say, an underground church, or the church is not partnered with the secular authority,
right,
these things never develop, because they never arise into public correction. Right. They still may happen as a fragmentation within the church, but you're not going to get to some of the abuses that happen in an inquisition that is tied up with the secular authority.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so this is one of the distinctions that we've discussed before, but I think everyone needs to to understand the slight difference, that in a one-off inquisition, if it's just a court convened for one case, in most of those cases throughout the Middle Ages, the inquisitors merely discern whether this is heresy, and then they offer correction. And if correction is not accepted, then they simply turn over a judgment of what it is. That is, this is heresy, so-and-so is persisting in heresy, if they didn't receive correction or accept it. So that's the worst case scenario, is now someone has been deemed a heretic. In that case, the inquisitor is finished with his job, formally. So we'll talk about the consequences of this. But the inquisitor then simply hands back the judgment to the secular authority.
Okay.
And typically what happens, and the reason you end up with executions in these cases, is that a judgment of heresy in the king's court or in a secular legal system would often be equated with treason.
Okay. Yeah.
And the remedy for treason, of course, is execution in many cases. So at least in that medieval framework, the church is not formally the means of punishment in that sense.
Yeah.
At least the means of secular punishment.
Right.
The church may excommunicate someone, they may do any of those types of things, but they are not carrying out the corporal punishment that is associated with it.
Mm-hmm. So the church may condemn somebody to as a heretic, but the way that's punished in civil law is different. It's a different matter. Is that right?
It would be different from place to place. But as I say, typically, if you're deemed a heretic in a Catholic country during the Middle Ages, the remedy would be execution.
Right.
Sometimes it's exile, but it could be execution.
So the church probably would have known that, right?
Yeah, certainly.
But that it's also an important distinction to be made. Like the church, as the church, wasn't going around executing people that it deemed to be heretics. The church was identifying heretics and then leaving that up to the judgment of the secular arm to make their decision as they would.
And in that way, it is at least formally different. I want to say that doesn't remove all responsibility.
Right.
But in some way, it's an important distinction, because what happens with the Spanish Inquisition is that there is no separation of those two legal systems.
Right.
And that's why it's often associated, when it went wrong, it represents the worst of the abuses of the Inquisition. And so it's important to note in that distinction, too, that when such judgments are carried out by the Holy Office within the papacy is a monarchical institution through most of its history, and even formally today. But the papacy does not then carry out execution, and has not done that in its own proper territories as a monarchy. So because it is the secular arm, again, there's no separation for the punishments there, but the punishments meted out from the papal courts were usually exile or house arrest or some variety of those two things.
Okay, so within the three kind of modes of the Inquisition that we've discussed, the really big area of the abuses that a lot of people will think of took place in the Spanish Inquisition.
Many of them, the iconic ones, really. I mean, the Inquisition can and has been abused in other phases, but the ideas that we have about the Spanish Inquisition, the kinds of things that lead to the Monty Python sketch, or
all come from the Spanish Inquisition, right?
The imagery is all from the Spanish Inquisition, and there is something that your listeners should know, and if they don't already, that the worst cases of that are represented in what's called an auto de fe.
Yeah, talk about that.
So that just means an act of faith, which seems benign,
right?
But it was itself a kind of blend of the secular and the ecclesial judgment, and it created in several, notable instances, a liturgy within which, or connected to which, sometimes these executions were carried out. And that is, I think, for most Catholics to hear that is hurtful. It's very, it's a clear perversion, I think, of what we all think of when we think of celebrating the sacrifice of the Mass.
Yeah, good gracious, yeah.
And it has all of those pieces of the pomp and the ceremony that become a kind of sick expression of celebration about those things. So, the Catholics should be aware there are serious issues to think about. The worst cases of these things became very public celebrations of the exertion of this power in ways that were domineering, and I don't think anyone would want them to come back into the life of the church that way.
Right.
I remember you showing us a picture about this in class, and maybe I can pull it up on here just to show y'all kind of what that would have looked like. And I remember being astonished.
It's like it's horrifying.
It is really ugly. And so I think in one sense, like as Doctor made the distinction, and Joey did too, like there's a formal distinction between the way that excommunication took place in a civil setting, but also that doesn't necessarily excuse or explain away all of the things that were attached to something like the Spanish Inquisition, particularly how it related to some of the church's liturgy, and she handled some of the heretics that she condemned. And I think that's where, like you said, I think that's where a lot of the popular picture of the Inquisition gets associated with things like the Salem witch trials, or the burning of Galileo, or the burning of any of these other people at the stake. And you have these pictures of just people burned at a stake, and cardinals and bishops standing there with their mitre and their huge golden cross and their cassocks and their all this stuff. Like that's what that gets associated because of some of those things. And so that's a popular notion because, like you said, and this is something we've talked about several times, is the liturgy is a public worship. It's the most public expression of the life of the church. And so when that goes off, everybody knows. There's an instinct, and people are like, something is weird about this and off about this. And so, but yes, I mean, so like as Catholics, this is something that we need to be aware of. Yeah.
We shouldn't try to, like when we try to defend Holy Mother Church, we shouldn't be naive to like some of the garbage that has seeped into her life over the course of her history. So like we should acknowledge these things. We should know that they took place. We should not try to like excuse the real abuses that did exist. And obviously when we need to remember too that we're dealing with a period of time, this is not an excuse, but kind of like something to keep in mind, a period of time in which, the secular and religious authorities were intermingled in a way that we can't really even conceive of today.
Right.
So that makes the situation much more complex. And also that the church is made up of men and of sinners.
I was thinking the same thing, Joey.
So like the church, she's holy and she's spotless because she contains the holy and spotless victim, but she is still made up of sinners. So when these situations arise, like, power corrupts, things get ugly, and it becomes weird.
Yeah, I think it's something that came up recently having to do with Galileo, which we might talk about. But Pope Benedict had said something when he was commemorating one of the anniversaries surrounding Galileo. And it was after a canonical review of Galileo's case in front of the Holy Office. And he was able to say, if you look at it juridically and canonically, etc., there's nothing wrong with the process. It was a valid legal process, let's say. But what he says very clearly, he says, you would be foolish, however, to try to establish an apologetics based upon that conduct of the Holy Office.
Right.
That it doesn't help anyone if you stand on formality and say, well, there wasn't anything legally wrong with it, therefore
we're excused.
Good. That kind of distinction should be made too. It's you can look at the lawful nature of such and such, but that doesn't necessarily describe the reality of it spiritually.
That's a good point to make.
And if people are inclined to defend the church, as I think we all are, and you do get sick of the constant emphasis, let's say, on the worst aspects of the church
for sure.
history. Nevertheless, you have to recognize, the church is, I refer to this sometimes, it is the longest standing human institution on the planet, and it is the most diverse and various institution, and it has seen all manner of things in its history.
Yeah.
And so you shouldn't pretend that doesn't include the bad as well as the good.
Right.
Despite its special nature, like you said, it's still
divinely inspired,
has
created,
has many mortal flaws,
including me. Anyways,
that's
I was
definitely
next,
the case.
But,
yeah, me too.
Well, okay, I do want to talk about Galileo briefly, and then maybe we had mentioned Joan of Arc too. I don't know if we could bring her into this, but before we do, so we've mentioned kind of the worst expression of the abuse, especially the Spanish Inquisition, is in this. What are they called again? The
auto de fe.
Auto de fe. Yeah, these liturgies of public executions, but nevertheless, if I'm correct, I'm guessing that most people still have an exaggerated view of the abuses that took place. So could you kind of give us some context for, the number of people that were executed, or was it like...
Oh, God, yes. So I think I get what you're pointing to. I'm not sure I have the numbers to hand, but there are a couple of famous cases of revising historical estimates, for instance.
Yeah.
The first point to make is that even in that medieval format, the first time we have judicial processes in medieval canon law. Many of them start around 1180 with problems that have to do with the Cathars. It's a heresy in southern France, but spread out to some degree. So you start to get canon law relative to these things. And these courts have rules.
Yeah.
And many times the rules, they're written by the church, and they have to do with judicial process. They have to do with timetables and so on. So if you are holding an inquisitorial court, even that early version of it, it takes a long time. You have to convene a proper court. You have to have the person who's held in prison in the meantime. They have to be interviewed according to certain rules. They have to be given pauses between interviews and time to accept correction. So the process is enormously drawn out relative to something like the secular courts of the day. And so it is more time-consuming, more expensive, more difficult for you to go through an inquisitorial court, for instance, than it is for you to be taken through the secular courts. If someone wanted to abuse a process against you and declare you a traitor, for instance, they would never do it by handing you to the Inquisition.
Yeah.
Because that means you get a whole different bureaucracy involved, you get a whole different process involved. It would be much more time-consuming and expensive. The effect of that is that really almost, the vast majority of cases before the Inquisition are settled by means of correction and some penance that would follow the correction. And it might involve, let's say, sacrificing whatever gains had been made by becoming a leader of a growing sect or something like that.
Okay.
And reconciling oneself to the church. That's the norm, is that these cases are resolved in that fashion.
Mm-hmm.
There had been earlier historical estimates made of something like 20,000 people being killed in the first 20 years of the Inquisition in Spain. More modern research has gone back to look at that, and what they've seen is that the recording of cases that went to the end, so to speak, had been vastly miscounted by a power of 10, essentially.
Wow.
So they think in that first 20 years of the Inquisition, perhaps 2,000 people in Spain, rather, were brought to an execution by means of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, that's still 2,000 people, of course. But
Right.
But it's not 20,000 people.
No.
And so there's still some precision to be added to this. And of course, historians who look at the church's records sometimes differ between historians that are Catholic and historians that aren't.
Right, naturally.
But some of that is now, I think, fortunately, just moving into the realm of simply accurately reading the records. And so really understanding some of the things that I do elsewhere in other fields would be paying attention to the manuscript records. How are they created? What do they really mean? Mm-hmm. If a case goes to the last phase, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone was executed.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Right, and that kind of thing.
And so I did want to talk about the Galileo case, because I know that's a specific event within the inquisitory process, the inquisitory office of the church, that is a very famous case, and I think a lot of people have questions about it.
We talked about it before, but it'd be good if we got the man himself.
The man himself. Galileo himself.
Galileo himself sitting here.
Galileo will be joining us.
Yes.
Thank you. Come on out.
Yes. Gravity.
So, do tell us about it. What happened? What took maybe a little bit of historical context to the thing, and then what was the church wrong, and in what way, if she was or if she wasn't, then let us know.
Well, I think my general take on the Galileo case is that when he was brought to his final trial, the church was very unwise in the way that they did that.
Classic imprudent church.
One of the things that we emphasize, or I emphasize this when I teach it, is in the early years of Galileo's case, let's say, when he starts to make observations with a telescope that seem to suggest that Copernicanism is really the accurate description of the universe as far as they know. At that point in time, the man in charge of the Holy Office was Cardinal Bellarmine. And Bellarmino, as he was called, was himself a great scientist and knew all of the current research. He had read everything Galileo had written. And while Bellarmine was in that office, there was an understanding, and he and Galileo could agree, that there was no scientific proof as yet that could firmly establish Copernicanism, the heliocentric version of Copernicanism. Mm-hmm. It already looked like the far superior mathematical model. It already looked like Galileo is examining Jupiter in his microscope or his telescope rather, and seeing something that looks rather like a solar system. Yeah. And so he's working in that direction, but it's an hypothesis. And they could agree as scientists that it had to remain as such until it could be proved, and that it would wait for much more powerful instruments later to be provable. That agreement even led to Bellarmine giving an affidavit to Galileo to say that Galileo was under no sanction at all, that there was no punishment involved, and that he never had been asked to recant anything. This was in 1616. Because immediately, even in the day, people assumed that because he had gone to speak with the Holy Office, that somehow he had been disciplined. Yeah. That was never the case while Cardinal Bellarmine lived, but he dies, unfortunately, in 1621. In the decade after, in the 1630s, Galileo publishes the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems.
Okay, yeah.
And again, one of the tragedies as we teach this in church history is that the Pope at the time is a friend of Galileo's. He too is a well-versed scientist.
Pope Urban?
Urban VIII, I think it is.
Yeah.
And they've read and talked about this issue many times. Some in the papal court, however, after the publication of this book, see that there is maybe an implicit insult if you take the church as representing the classical model in the dialogue and Galileo as representing the new model. If you apply that analogy or if you make it allegorical even and make it a strict analogy, then they take offense on behalf of the church. And so at that point...
Yeah, sorry, Doctor, real quick, just to clarify, this book that Galileo writes, it's a dialogue. So for those of you who don't know what that means, so it's like Plato wrote dialogues too, but it's writing... Yeah, he's writing out an argument, but in the form of like a story that recounts a conversation between two people.
And famously, the person who represents the classical view of the world is a character called Simplicius.
Simplicius,
You remember this guy?
Yeah.
Which means simpleton, essentially.
That's you, Joe. You're Simplicius, right?
The nicknames can begin. So people took offense on behalf of the Pope about this.
Yeah.
And some of the younger clergymen in the Holy Office decided to open an inquisition for Galileo.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of ways in which this was not just unwise, I think, but really damaging to the church. For one thing, Galileo, well aware of the stakes here, had given the whole book to the censors in the papal offices to read beforehand, and yet they allowed it to be published.
This is after Bellarmine, right?
This is after Bellarmine has passed. So the censors in the Holy Office have read it and allowed it to be published, and only later do they take offense and bring him to trial.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that's a bad look. Yeah.
And it creates an image very well captured in several famous paintings of this event of the eminent older scientist being called forward and humiliated by these arrogant young churchmen.
Yeah.
Who are not of the same scientific stature that he is. And so that's the image, unfortunately, that persists after Galileo's case. And Galileo himself never does this. Galileo accepts the judgment. He moves into a house arrest, which is restrictive. His mail is being read, and he's not allowed to publish in this topic anymore.
But he's not tortured.
He's not tortured. He continues to work in other fields and to publish in other fields. But clearly, this is a public humiliation of him and a restriction of him, and it leads many other, even Catholic scholars, to leave Catholic territories and go to work for courts and other sponsors who are in Protestant territories, like Sweden with Queen Christina and others. And so it's one of these things that, unfortunately, it leaves this odor of separation for, I would say, several hundred years.
Yeah. Right.
That puts the common perception of the church as though it's, pitted against science
or anything. And so so the response of some of the academics or intellectuals of the time was, do you see the way they handled Galileo? They're going to do the same to us if we stick around.
So what if I get hauled before the Inquisition as well? And that's, they fear that. And so sometimes you have this discussion of a brain drain from Catholic countries in that period of time. It certainly affects the reputational, history of the church.
I want to highlight this thing that you mentioned earlier, like the initial conversation between Galileo and the church began in large part with Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, a man who is a contemporary scientist of his time, and a man who knew science well and largely agreed with Galileo, but recognized, hey, this theory is not 100% provable yet, right? And so there's a complementarity going on here, right? So the church wants to talk to Galileo about this proposed theory, and Cardinal is saying, okay, so let's talk about this theory, but let's talk about this theory and don't say this is the theory that we should all abide by. And so in that sense, there's a real level of friendship going on between the two men, right? These exchanges and letters, and you read the exchanges between the two, and you begin to see that clearly. It's not until after that the church kind of begins to drop the ball on the situation, if you will. Is that right?
Yeah, I think Bellarmine, certainly had the respect of Galileo as well as vice versa, to keep the line at what was an appropriate hypothesis.
Right.
Yeah, like according to the scientific method. Right.
And so to keep the science where the science is most valid. And remember, if people don't know this, the whole question of heliocentric theory begins with Copernicus in the 1540s. So, 70 years before Galileo picks up the topic, a Catholic priest, Nicholas Copernicus, has published the theory of heliocentrism as a hypothesis, and it never caused any stir. There was never. Now it does appear after his life because he knows it might, but he presents it as a hypothesis very carefully, and so that's never controversial until it gets to Galileo's period.
Gotcha.
Right. And like I said, it never goes badly wrong until, unfortunately, Cardinal Bellarmine is not there to guide it in the way that he was guiding it.
Yeah, so Cardinal Bellarmine, in my mind, the way he handled the case represents like the church's relationship to science at its best. Like the church, and this is why it's such a shame that the case has left this odor of the faith being pitted against science, is because the church historically and traditionally, and when it's at its best, has been, like very open to the pursuit of truth and all the scientific, forms of knowledge, and even on the forefront a lot of that exploration. So the fact that we leave this, we pass this Galileo case, with this reputation that now the church is against science. That's what makes it such a shame. And what was the ultimate judgment of the Holy Office? Was it that he was insulting the church with this dialogue, or was it?
No. It's funny because at the end of his process, as I said, he's not punished as a heretic. He's not even really accused of heresy per se. Sure. He accepts the faith. He accepts correction in this way. But the correction that they require of him is that he swear off Copernicanism as a teachable doctrine presented as truth.
Right.
And so he's never asked to swear off anything he wrote. He's never asked to abandon his own work.
Interesting.
He's only asked to say that he would never hold or consider Copernicanism to be an established truth. Not that it, couldn't be considered as a theory.
Yeah.
So for a long time, Copernicanism and works associated with Copernicanism will then be added to the index as not teachable.
Sure.
But they're not burned or sought out and eliminated. They're a theory, kept as a theory, but they're not to be taught. And at stake here, of course, with the question of the Earth going around the sun rather than vice versa.
It's because we all agree that the Earth is flat. But yeah, go ahead. Just kidding.
Yeah, that's one of the things
don't get Dr. Graff started about the flat earthers.
So it does seem to directly conflict with some of the language of the Bible, where the sun is spoken of as standing still or as moving in the sky.
Yeah.
And so if you propose that the sun is stable, then of course you would have to work out then what is the conflict between these interpretations. And in that respect too, Bellarmine was successful at saying, since there's no means of proving the science remains as an hypothesis. But he also says in a letter to someone else about the same topic, he says, if there were a scientific proof of this, then there would be a responsibility for the church to revisit her understanding of Scripture. Because Scripture and science cannot be in conflict here.
Yeah.
But he also is careful to say it would not be the responsibility of the scientists making the proof. It would be the responsibility of the church.
Yeah.
Thanks be to God. Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and that's part of those things where, to maintain the proper authority of the church, one of the things that prompted this whole affair is that Galileo understood what it would mean, and he began to speculate about how you could change the teaching of Scripture. Now, that's not really his responsibility or his field.
Right.
It's not his lane, so to speak.
Yeah.
But most scientists who did these observations are Catholic, and they do understand, well, this is going to upset.
Right, we're going to have to rethink
this implies a
some
lot.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, but part of Bellarmine's point was, well, you worry about the science, and if you were to be able to prove it, then we'll deal with how we may have misunderstood Scripture.
Yeah.
Right. Not that it would be in the pocket of the scientist to somehow solve that problem as well.
Right.
So it's those are important distinctions to make. And I sometimes follow up by saying how Bellarmine is never canonized until the 20th century. Yeah, and that's part of this reputational damage, is that he was universally recognized for what he did, even in his own day. And yet it's only in the 20th century where the church doesn't have any sort of public stigma about being separated from science in a way that canonizing Cardinal Bellarmine no longer strikes anyone as somehow a statement against science.
Right.
And
yeah.
So, he waited a long time
to get his. I'm sure he's fine though. I'm sure he's doing okay.
Yeah, he's hanging out. He doesn't care about Joey or me right now necessarily. Although maybe he does. Anyways, but I do want to say some people, even myself, I think for a long time thought that the church hasn't come out and apologized or said anything about this case since.
Oh,
but you brought up Pope Benedict for one.
Yeah,
right.
The church has revisited this many times, especially in the last 3-4 papacies, I would think. John Paul II, gave addresses about this directly on some of the anniversaries of his observations. Benedict XVI as well. Even Pope Francis has commemorated some of these things when they come up with things like the groups like the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences. The papacy has its own observation, or has its own observatory.
Right.
The church is very involved in these things, and popes have lauded Galileo. Mm-hmm. Even as Benedict said, the canonical process was fine, no formal fault in it, but he says it's very unwise.
Yeah.
And lauds Galileo for having undergone it in the way that he did.
Yeah.
Without leaving the church, for instance, or without
taking the punishment.
It's a terrible thing what happened to his reputation and completely unnecessary, perhaps, in hindsight. But he's universally recognized among, scientists in the heart of the church now. And the detail that is still out there hanging, as far as I know, is that the papacy even commissioned a statue of Galileo with the intention of putting it up inside the Vatican walls somewhere.
Really? Wow.
But Roman decision-making being what it is, it's my understanding that the statue was made in 2008 and that it's still somewhere in a closet because no one can agree upon where to put it.
Oh, my gosh.
That is church bureaucracy.
That's bureaucracy for you right
I'd
there.
love if anyone knows that, if it has been put up, I'd love to be updated on that.
Wow.
But I don't know that it's ever been placed.
Yeah, man. How are we doing on time?
I think we're okay. Yeah, we're doing right. Good.
Should we talk about Joan of Arc? Does that relate to this?
I think I'd like to.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Because I don't know what segue you would like here, but I think of Joan of Arc's case because people don't often realize that she was put through the Inquisition. That's how she ends her life, being executed after an Inquisition. Joan of Arc, of course, the famous French maiden who leads the French forces against the English in the 100 Years' War.
Of course.
But she is this very unusual figure in history. She receives this sort of divine instruction, and she puts herself at the head of an army, which is just uniquely strange in history. And that army retakes France and gives it back to the French king in waiting, Charles VII at the time. And in the late stages of that war, Joan is captured by the Burgundians, who are at that time an ally of the English. She's handed over to the English, who configure an inquisitorial court in that medieval fashion.
Yeah.
So they make a one-off court to hear the case of Joan of Arc. And the processes of that case are in a full record left to us today. They're all in French, and so it's sort of a law French dialect. But it's the story of how she was interviewed, her whole imprisonment, her responses to all the inquisitors' questions. In the end, many of the inquisitors disagree, but the English managed to bring her to a conviction, and they burn her at the stake. The end result of all of that, however, is that the process of her execution and the records of that inquisitorial trial have become the primary record on the basis of which she was canonized.
Yeah.
That is wild.
How old was she? She was young.
She rises up at the age of 14.
Hey, all right, so look, here's the thing, dude. At 14, I'm pretty sure I was still drinking chocolate milk by myself. You know what I'm saying? Just that's wild.
14-year-old girl leading armies out there and getting, well, that's the other thing too, is getting martyred essentially by the church itself.
Well, the formal charge against her that sticks in the end is a charge of blasphemy.
Wow.
Because they consider that she is representing her own wishes as God's wishes. Nevertheless, in the whole record of the trial, she is steadfast at never extrapolating from the things that she says she was told. And she never makes them bigger than they were. She resists every temptation to claim any credit for it. She patiently suffers everything about the process.
Gosh.
She remains steadfast to the end. She even forgives her inquisitors it's a remarkable, just
14
a remarkable
years old.
record.
That's wild.
And one of the tells about this, if your listeners ever, if they're fond of Mark Twain, for instance, one of the most interesting things that I know about Mark Twain is that he was an absolute devotee of Joan of Arc.
Yeah.
He wrote
massive book.
He wrote about her. Yeah, and he
was not Catholic.
No, he's not Catholic at all. He did visit the Vatican on his trips abroad, which is a very funny series of descriptions if you ever read his descriptions of his trips. But as cynical as he is, as worldly as he was, he would fight people for the reputation of Joan of Arc. And remember, he's writing in a time before she was canonized as well. She's not canonized until the end of World War I.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Oh my gosh.
That's crazy that he would have
he had
such a respect and devotion to her.
I would say a devotion. And it was unique as far as I can tell in his written life.
Yeah.
Did he ever explain why? I guess maybe it would be worth reading.
He writes about it a lot, but it's I just think he considered her so unique in the circumstances of her history that he could not explain her in any other way. And so he spent a lot of time with her, and I think that's a really interesting
That's so
record.
Cool.
It is.
And it's interesting, this pattern you see in the lives of the saints is at some point they suffer persecution from the church itself. Like a lot of time the church doesn't really know what to do with saints.
Yeah.
And so because the church is made up of sinners who are both...
Well, speak for yourself.
Because it's both a human and a divine institution, but also, it's very human. A lot of times the church... just deals with these saints who are truly living for the kingdom of heaven poorly.
We just celebrated St. Padre Pio, and that's what I was reminded of too. Like he went through a lot.
Yeah.
He went through a lot with the church, and especially at the time the church was going through a lot, especially in Italy. And he just, but no, you're right, Joey. I think your observation is true. It's like oftentimes those who are, saints undergo a lot of scrutiny, even by the church, both in and outside of the church, but also it's tough when it's a family member. You know what I mean? It's tough when it's a family member.
That dynamic, though, is bound to happen. The great mystics of the church, too. It always falls on the bishop to figure out whether a mystic is a mystic or if there's something else happening.
Right, yeah.
Is this someone's genuine experience? Is there mental illness involved?
Right.
Discerning what the reality of that is a difficult thing.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the bits of us as church that don't recognize the divine are willing to persecute it as well.
Yeah.
That's good.
Cool. Dr. Graff, is there, first of all, it's been awesome to have you on. Is there anything else you want to discuss that you think that listener to Logos podcast should know about the Inquisition, about the Middle Ages, about you, about...
No, I mean, I think that, I would love to meet people who, even in the parish and so on, who do a little bit of this reading and digging themselves.
Yeah.
It's really there. Sources are really available. And I think one thing that Catholics should be aware of is we have a number of resources, even online, that are reliable. And so something as simple as the Catholic Encyclopedia online would give you a really detailed look at something like this. So if you hear a take on the Inquisition, or if you hear a take on some other aspect of the church, usually there is good information that you can at least use to compare with what you've heard.
Sure.
Right.
And so I would just urge people to be active that way. And I think what you guys are doing is great in terms of trying to draw these things into discussions that give some context.
Right. And that's the idea, just to bring people into that discussion and through the kind of intellectual and life of the church, draw people into an encounter with our Lord, and to bring them, to know that first, that the church is credible, okay? That man is kind of drawn, he's a religious being, and that through these discussions we can kind of tap into, the Logos, the order in which Christ has imbued creation with, and through the history of the church, through philosophy, through theology or spiritual life. We hope to do that, and we thank you for enabling that endeavor.
Thank you guys.
Yeah. So, I mean, summary, takeaways, the Inquisition, it happened. It's not as bad as a lot of people will want you to believe it is. It was a normal and even a good function of the church in many situations, Were there abuses that we need to be aware of and like own up to? Yes. But don't let people who have a particular idea of the way that history went convince you that things were the way that they actually weren't, you know?
Yeah, Joe Rogan isn't the only philosopher and theologian or historian out there in the world. You know, there are other sources like Dr. Graff himself. Thank you, Dr. Graff.
Thank you, guys.
That was awesome.
Yeah,
I enjoyed it.
Really
it's a lot of fun.
And if you ever want to sue somebody, you can sue Joey. Leave me out of the equation, please. I have no money and for anything. But you guys, listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode. As we said at the beginning of the episode, consider giving to us on Patreon. Check us out on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. We're here for you. We're praying for you.
Praying for you, yeah.
At least I am. And thank y'all for everything. Joey, any last words?
As always, God bless.
God bless.
I took it from you, bro. I took it from you.